This week, Josh Corman joins us to talk about the China threat, all the typhoons, and how do we get better visibility into appliances. Stay tuned. Below the Surface coming up next. Welcome to Below the Surface, episode number 42, being recorded on Wednesday, November 20th, 2024. I'm your host, Paul Asadoorian, joined by Mr. Allan Alford. Allan, very nice to have you.
Thank you, sir.
Loving it, loving it. Before we dig into it with Josh, Below the Surface listeners can learn more about Eclipsium by visiting eclipsium.com/go. There you'll find the ultimate guide to supply chain security, an on-demand webinar I presented called Unraveling Digital Supply Chain Threats and Risk, a paper on the relationship between ransomware and the supply chain, and a customer case study with DigitalOcean. If you're interested in seeing our product in action, you can sign up for a demo. All that on eclipsium.com/go. Mr. Josh Corman, welcome to the show. A man who needs no introduction, but certainly fill us in on where you're working today and what you're working on.
Hello. Thanks for having me on this show. I continue to be an idiot altruist with too many nonprofits and whatnot. So still running IamTheCavalry.org, 11 years old, CyberMedSummit.org, which is like 7 years old. And this year during Hacker Summer Camp, I launched a new nonprofit, pretty urgent one, backed by Craig Newmark and housed at IST, the Institute for Science and Technology, Security and Technology. Sorry, I gotta wake up. The Institute for Security and Technology, the ones that run the ransomware task force. It's kind of like a think tank, but it's more like a critical action think tank. And that project is called Undisruptable 27, which we're going to talk about because it relates to critical infrastructure lifelines in China in a very short time frame. But good to see you. I'm also a brand new dad again, so I'm very
congratulations on
sleep
that.
deprived.
But sleep deprived, yes.
I hope I can form cogent sentences.
I think you're going to do fine.
We trust you. We trust you.
So, John and Allan, just for context in our listeners as well, obviously I've worked in this industry for the better part of 25 years, and at this juncture, not much jars me or it really keeps me up at night because I've just seen so much. If there is something that I'm concerned about and keeps me up at night, it's probably a big deal, at least in my mind, right? And Josh, you and I a while ago had started having conversations about Chinese threat actors. And recently, what they're up. Recently, I'm talking in the past couple of years, what are they up to? And you described this geopolitical climate that has maybe not even dotted lines, but direct lines into to the activities that we're actively observing today. That kind of this scares me. If there's one thing that keeps me up at night, it's this situation that we are in. And when I say we, I think I mean the entire world, right? In terms of what's happening with China's relationship with Taiwan and then China's relationship with the rest of the world, particularly the U.S. And then that's backed up by things I've observed since we first talked. So, Josh, give us kind of your take, a lay of the land as to what's happening today with this China threat.
So you're asking the sleep-deprived new dad to summarize the geopolitical context in 60 seconds or so?
Pretty much.
You got it. Okay. But you got as much time as you want. You don't have 60 seconds. You can take more than that. That's fine. And it's a discussion, so you can throw it back to Allan and I for
I know. So. Look, we live in a global context. We've had superpowers jockeying for who's in charge of what. Sometimes it's hot wars, sometimes it's cold wars, sometimes it's lukewarm wars, but each of these great superpowers wants to advance their nation's interests. We each bring different skills and weaknesses to the mix. The West is much more focused on free markets and innovation and more outsourcing. The whole globalization movement started with NAFTA. Not started with, but you might remember the NAFTA chapter.
Wow, it's going back to the 90s. Right?
So you could draw a line back to when did we start treating the world more like a global market with specialization, and how do we want to differentiate our place in geopolitics, but also the economy, the global economy, globalization. And I'm going to skip a lot of steps here, but we made a bunch of choices in good faith across different presidencies, across different parties. I'm going to stay nonpartisan on this. But at some point, we became an incredibly entangled, somewhat deliberately entangled world. So what might be right for your business leaders might be to start selling to China, producing in China. But what might be right for your security team, for your enterprise, might be not exposing intellectual property electively in ways that could harm you eventually. The U.S. tends to think in quarters for quarterly earnings. China tends to think in 100 years or long periods of time and strategy. And I think what's a little bit fascinating for me is like if you go back to like the first time people started using APT, like Richard Baitlick and others, and people were making fun of, kitten killing Chinese, xenophobia.
2006, 7-ish time frame around there, right? Is when we started. APTs became a thing. This is my guess.
Like you don't have to be xenophobic or nationalistic to just pay attention to, like, there's that old Maya Angelou quote, right? When someone tells you who they are, believe them. And pretty much everything we've seen China do in this new space of cyberspace, either for, industrial espionage, corporate espionage, advancing nation state stuff, they've said they're going to do it, and then they go do it, and then we all look surprised when they've done it. So this was a really long, slow moving matriculation of how we got from where we started to where we are. And every country's got their own interests, and they're going to advance those interests with every tool they have in their tool belt, with their strengths, their weaknesses. And China continues to do it. It's not the only global threat or global rival, or sometimes it's cooperation, sometimes it's competition, sometimes it's co-opetition, right? Frenemies. Depends on the topic.
Yeah, we don't want to ignore the other nation state threat that I know others have talked about a little more on some of their podcasts. Iranian hackers and the threat from Iran, and of course Russia as well. We're
Lazarus Group
out of the conversation. Yeah, Lazarus Group, right? Another one. So
if you
China is China operating differently than a lot of the other nation state threat actors, or there's still some similarities in there?
Well, they're large and patient and organized, and funded. So I think it's the only true rival to the U.S. at the moment across the different topics. One of the things I was going to say is, like, when they were trying to steal intellectual property to double-digit grow their GDP, like they said they would, they did it, right? We had the Uber vacuum cleaner, and everyone was in shock and awe after it was too late. And then they basically made it pretty clear they want to advance on Taiwan as early as 2027. Dimitri and others think it'll be later than that, so we'll put a little asterisk next to 2027.
Wait, who's Dimitri?
Dmitry Alperovich.
Oh, from
CrowdStrike co-founder, but also wrote the On the Brink book about all this, and it's kind of become a expert on war with China. So he and others, say maybe it's later because Putin didn't have such an easy time with Ukraine. So maybe it's not easy to do a multi-pronged maneuver like this, and it's going to take longer. But there's intentions and plans.
But what we're implying here is that China wants to go take over Taiwan, similarly to how Russia wants to take over Ukraine, and in that those activities, there are cyber operations that may be targeted at other countries as basically like a stay off our lawn, stay out of it.
All right,
kind of thing. That's one potential scenario.
Yeah. So when I talk about Undisruptible 27, which I won't yet, I do say a lot of people, even our close friends, are like, I was hanging out with a bunch of OG hackers on 4th of July, and they were very skeptical that these things would play out the way I was saying until we talked about it and had more beers. But let me be really coarse with a high margin of error just for brevity. China wants to advance on Taiwan. They've been doing a lot of things in that direction.
Sure.
At the moment, we can't let that happen. The U.S. can't let that happen. So we have this situation where they want to do something. We currently can't detangle ourselves from some of that dependence geopolitically and with our allies.
Much of our electronics and chip manufacturing for the U.S. is done in Taiwan.
beyond the fact that it's a nice thing to do and the right thing to do to protect people that you say you're going to protect. So topic one is they're going to move within a certain time frame. Topic number two is we can't let them within that same time frame. Maybe eventually we have enough onshore or we've diversified and deglobalized enough. But right now, they're going to advance before we can let them. So of the many different things like building islands, moving, aircraft carriers, building up armies, etc. Cyber is part of their military. Cyber is part of their national tool belt, tool chain, toolbox. And what they've done with Volt Typhoon, and we've now declassified as of January 31st of this year, the four horsemen of cyber went to Congress in an unclassified briefing and said, hey, under this particular campaign called Volt Typhoon, it's just one of the many, many campaigns with silly names that we've desensitized to. This particular one's very scary to me because what they revealed was sort of soft revealed by Rob Joyce and the NSA a year prior with that living off the land document that was kind of cryptic. They said as much as they could possibly say without saying it. But this particular campaign has been found and evicted from U.S. water facilities and other critical infrastructure. And the point, I don't love this word, but the point they keep using is pre-positioning. And the idea is it's not there to ransom you or to spring a trap after they have a coffee cup. It's there to do destructive. It's there as a deterrent, but it's there to do destructive harm to U.S. critical infrastructure on U.S. soil as one of their tools in their tool belt with their strategic ambitions towards Taiwan. What do I mean by that? Think of it as an escalatory ladder. It's not like they would declare war by blowing up water mains across the U.S. And people forget the destructive part. It's not about locking it up for a couple of days. You raise the pressure, you burst the pipes, you do this thing called a water hammer, and you've got multi-year damage. And no water, no hospital in about 4 hours, which I hope we touch on. So what you have is, think of it like, I'm not a sports ball person, but level one is it's a deterrent. It's like, we're in your business. If you get into ours, you'll regret it. So don't get into our business, right? Stay out of it. But I just told you 3 minutes ago, we can't stay out of it. So then level two on the rung is, all right, if you start to cross a line or approach a line, we'll give you a brushback pitch, right? We'll give you a warning shot, perhaps. And that'll be so devastating. Just look how devastating the psychological impact was of 9/11. It wasn't the body count. It was the psychological trauma. Just 2 towers, just 3 planes. Look how long the tail of trauma was to U.S. citizens on U.S. soil.
It's still happening.
So even just one demonstration of force could be pretty bad, in my opinion. Some people in the Beltway disagreed, but I think they're wrong. And then more likely, given how China looks at warfare, it would probably be all out chaos is the phrase they use. So like Christopher Wray said, they'd like to rain chaos on U.S. critical infrastructure. So I think it's the easiest way to put it is we live in glass houses with our critical infrastructure. It's wildly brittle, prone, bad practices everywhere, underinvested, but hyper connected. So we live in glass houses. If we have a conflict, whether it's with Russia, China, Iran, any conflict, it will be a hybrid conflict. And we will start to see those glass houses shattered, right? So I think the precedent here that catches my attention after the 25 years, I can't remember what year I met you, but like we've known each other a long time. A lot of things, very few things scare me, but the ones that do catch my attention tend to be on the money. And when I saw this, I said, okay, so it's not a matter of theoretically these water and wastewater facilities could be hacked. Theoretically, they could do damage. It's more like your enemy has kind of put a remote detonation bomb into every single piece of infrastructure you have. And we're just kind of hoping they don't press the button.
Right. And hope is not a strategy. And what's the old quote about, anarchy is just 2 paychecks away, right?
Well, I'm a
2 missed paychecks away.
Formerly trained philosopher, like the state of nature, state of war, nasty brutish in short. And like, we are kind of animals and humans are about 48 hours from, falling apart sometimes if you see natural disasters or riots. So I would like to not mess with our basic lifeline human needs like, water, power, food, emergency care. And some of our weakest infrastructure, hyper connected to the global economy, it's global supply chains is in that vicinity. So netting this out, even though it's probably rambly, China has national ambitions for its economy and its country that include Taiwan plus or minus 2027. we probably can't let them do it. And if we interfere, they've told us what they would do to weaken domestic support for that intervention. Mm-hmm. And guess what? The last I checked, we're almost to 2025, and 2027 is, what can you do in 2 years, plus or minus? And if you don't think China will do this, the fact that China can so easily compromise these prone systems, get kicked out and come back in again, means they're also exposed to other accidents and adversaries. So whether we have a cross a line with Putin, like maybe this week, whether we have another flare up from Iran or the Cyber Avengers hacktivist group in the Middle East, like we have seen plural actors in water facilities and power and hospitals. And I think we've been lucky thus far that most of the cyber activity has either been credit cards or PHI or intellectual property or financially motivated. But these denial service attacks are pretty devastating to public safety, human life. And if they're destructive, we don't really have a robust supply chain to have replacement parts for all these things. We're kind of a just-in-time, hyper efficient economy. So we might be able to fix like some of the big cities right away with supplies on hand, but Flint, Michigan's water's been messed up for how long? We haven't fixed it. So imagine doing a Flint, Michigan on every community in the country.
Alan, I set this up.
Sorry.
And Josh, you did a great job of setting the landscape. Thoughts, questions, Alan?
Yeah, there's an irony in all this to me that I think needs to be spoken about that we don't talk about. Like why don't we want China taking Taiwan? Well, let's start with the fact that all the chips around here tend to be made in China or made in Taiwan, right? And we all know that the Chinese chips are a threat. This is our last safe haven, and I guess there's some coming out of the Philippines, a little bit out of Japan. I mean, there's, I'm reducing an entire global market into two major players, but at the end of the day, we can't afford to have all of our chip production or the vast bulk of it being Chinese. We can't, full stop, because everything Josh is talking about propagates and becomes even easier. We don't know what's in half these chips. We don't. And that's frightening to me.
Well, this push towards entangled global markets and frenemies and co-opetition made a lot of sense unless you look at what we always knew with threat models and risks in cyberspace, right?
I think that some of the concern, and I think there's validity to this, is that I look at the thermal exhaust port threat, right? And I think we do have conversations about that. It largely, in terms of like number of threats we've discovered, they haven't been the thermal exhaust port threat, right?
Yeah.
Where there's a purpose built design flaw into the hardware that we then deploy out into our infrastructure, critical or not, right? As however you want to define critical.
Well,
we've seen some examples of that. We're going to see some examples of that, but it's not the most frequently occurring threat. If I look at Volt Typhoon, I don't think they're relying on that.
No.
Fair enough. But I'm thinking of the bootleg Cisco cards that made their way into Navy intelligence and other key places.
Sure, there have been incidents. We
don't know what was on those.
It's also a somewhat difficult threat to detect.
Yeah,
that I think is a factor we oftentimes don't consider when we look at things like Spectre and Meltdown as very low level, microcode level problems in vulnerabilities, I should say, in chips. We haven't observed attackers using that at any grand scale. I've done a lot of research into speculative execution. I've asked around, and I don't see evidence that it's being exploited. However, what I do find is one of the kind of asterisks on that, right, is it's also very difficult to detect. And I think the hardware implants and thermal exhaust port threats are also fall in that category. So I don't want to discount either threat.
There's a metaphor.
But I don't want to make it top of mind either, because again, if we look at what we can observe today, Volt Typhoon, Sol Typhoon, Flax Typhoon, Velvet Ant,
they're not all equal.
They're not all equal, and they're all using different techniques. And largely, those I've not seen them rely on hardware-based flaws that were put there on purpose. Anyway,
right.
So some evidence in Pacific Rim going after some of the lower level threats.
The metaphor I like to use is there was an American embassy built in Moscow many years ago, And
the typewriter.
this was the one where
Typewriter.
they were scanning constantly for possible bugs, because obviously you're relying on Russian materials and construction to get your thing built over there in Russia. And they swore it was clean, no bugs found, everything was working great. It turns out there were these passive triggered upon reception bugs built into the cinder block walls, and all you had to do was aim a signal at it, and suddenly it would wake up and become a bug.
Right.
But without that signal, it was that was a thermal exhaust port play. Like, we've seen this; it does exist.
They also
and maybe I'm being paranoid and weird, but I'm confident that stuff's out there on a scale that we don't know yet.
Right.
And I'd rather my chips were made in Taiwan, personally.
But even when they're not maliciously made, right? We have such poor hygiene, top to bottom, right?
Yes.
We will not get into a huge SBOM thing here, but like, I've been pushing SBOMs in public policy since December of 2014. So that was almost a decade ago in Congress, before it was happening before Congress. And that's just to say, hey, we know people are using known exploitable libraries that have fixes. Right. Can we at least be transparent about which libraries you're using, so that if there's an attack in the wild, we can say, am I affected? Where am I affected?
Right.
You know, I know Paul and I passionately talked about, there's all these countermeasures you can build into the stack that no one's availing themselves of, right? The reason when I was at CISA during the pandemic work, I did the CISA.gov bad practices, and I listed 3 things that are just dangerous every day, twice on Tuesdays, and they're legion in critical infrastructure: the use of unsupported end-of-life operating systems, use of hard-coded passwords, make it on the internet. So we know we have bad hygiene. So malicious intent is not a prerequisite to harm. We don't have to have the deliberately placed exhaust port, thermal exhaust port, to allow people to waltz into water facilities.
Right, because what I've seen, and I've studied, not as much as others maybe have studied, but I have studied the Chinese threat actor campaigns. Right, they're not all typhoons. Again, Pacific Rim, Velvet Ant. One of the commonalities through most of those campaigns are either a 0-day vulnerability, or what's common mostly in Volt Typhoon is targeting devices that are end of life, that have vulnerabilities that won't be patched by the vendor. And we're seeing this on a more frequently occurring basis than I was seeing it years ago when I tracked IoT devices, very, very closely. And that concerns me greatly. You can find Cisco small business gear across these campaigns that is targeted, which turns out they're just Linux-based ARM devices that have vulnerabilities that Cisco goes, nope, that's end of life. We're not supporting it anymore. We're not releasing a fix.
Right. Why bother creating the thermal exhaust port when this wealth of attack surface is already there?
Exactly.
There's so many.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's fair.
Target rich. So, I mean, there's plenty to talk about on deliberate things. The philosopher me zooms out and says, when I launched the Cavalry was in Vegas 11 years ago, and I said, our dependence on connected technology is growing faster than our ability to secure it. Over time, I said, well, this is the Dan Gear mentoring coming through. This is how he talks, but like, through over dependence on undependable things, we create conditions where we're exposed to accidents and adversaries with, elevated consequences. So then in the executive order post SolarWinds, the whole phrase I got into the White House's head was, in the end, the trust we place in digital infrastructure should be proportional to how trustworthy and transparent that infrastructure is, and to the consequences you'll incur if that trust is misplaced. So there's a lot packed into that. But what do you do when you can't trust that stack?
That's a brilliant summary, though.
But zoom out. Like, what do you do when you can't trust this stuff? There's a really seminal paper from Danzig called Surviving on a Diet of Poison Fruit. Like, if you have to eat poisonous stuff, like, how do you do this? And this is a supply chain paper early on. I mean, people have added to that conversation since it was written. But when you can't trust this stuff, the way I look at it is we had this period where we trusted everything blindly. And we are now over-dependent on undependable things, whether it's CrowdStrike accidents or deliberate Chinese campaigns or a ransom crew that accidentally kills people in a hospital denial service. That's the overdependence phase. We may switch to right sizing, that we're only as dependent as it's dependable eventually. But in the meantime, where we don't know, because we don't have transparency for SBOM, we don't have transparency in the hardware firmware stack, we don't have vendor accountability. So while we are trusting unknown trustability, The only thing you can rationally do is make sure that you're never dependent on something that can't, where the consequences of wrong are too high. And what that tells me is, like, here's a tiny little split the difference that just irked me so much during the election. This is not a partisan point. Every time I saw Jen Easterly get up on TV from CISA, she would say, one of the reasons this is the safest election ever is these systems are not connected to the internet, right? Voting systems are not connected. And I'm like, so what we're establishing in that statement, whether you agree with it or not, it's a statement from an official, is it is safer to not be connected to the internet for democracy, right? Well, can we then apply, is it therefore unsafe to have your water and wastewater for your town on the internet? Is it therefore unsafe to have your singular level 2 trauma center in the state, connected to the internet? So we have not reckoned, even in our own industry, let alone society, on, are we over dependent on undependable things? Are we upside down on our mortgage? Do we have too much technical and security debt, to be safe and sound? And I think what you're going to see maybe after harm is people will retreat from things like, we'll say, right, I'll connect my blog or my e-commerce site to the internet, but I will not connect my singular water facility to the internet. Like the whole idea of shields up, when I launched this initiative, I said, maybe it's connections down. Like, a long time ago, we said, if you can't afford to protect it, you can't afford to connect it, which sounds draconian, but like, if there's incoming missiles at your vulnerable, team viewer for the water and wastewater with a hard-coded password, if you know an attack's coming tomorrow, wouldn't you maybe consider shutting down and going manual for a day if you could? I think the riskier part is a lot of these OT, critical infrastructure operators we speak to, they're so dependent on remote connectivity and AI.
Yep. And I think we all are.
Management
in every industry.
Can't go analog.
In every
right?
industry, where in the CrowdStrike example, shined a light on that. We're all hyper focused on and rely on this connectivity and computer systems in order to operate.
Yeah, it's the old usability versus security conversation. That's all this is, really.
But Allan, I never thought of this until you reminded me of that embassy in Russia that was passive. Like, all these flaws, deliberate or otherwise, that are in all the software, they're perfectly safe until someone points their attention at it.
Until someone aims the signal at it and wakes it up. Yeah.
Hence, we live in glass houses and people are about to start throwing rocks. So,
Yeah.
If I look at the targets from a lot of the campaigns, and by recently, I mean maybe in the past 4 years is what I can date some of these back to, the commonality is not necessarily going after the enterprise grade appliances or software. It's going after SOHO routers, IoT routers, and gaining a foothold. Not using it for ransomware, but using it to move data around, using it to be potentially disruptive, using it to launch other attacks that do take down infrastructure, which I just find frightening. I date it back to my 2011 BrewCon talk, where it was before we had the term IoT devices. It was called embedded devices in my plot to take over the world.
Yep.
And it was basically a map of, and a game plan of, if I was an evil attacker group, how would I compromise these devices to achieve my goals? And then I listed objectives of what I need to get to be able to take over the world.
Yep.
And it used IoT devices primarily to
Of course.
that. Fast forward to today, and we're seeing a lot of things I talked about in 2011 being used by Chinese threat actors, which now just greatly that's one thing. That's one reason why, Josh, when we talk about this, I'm frightened. This is scary.
I think we said this last week in our one-on-one chat, but I've always been really frustrated when someone says, "Yeah, but it's not, a reliable exploit," or it's it made just denial of service a thing. Well, denial of service is plenty enough when it's an infrastructure attack, right? So this idea that you have to be super stealthy ninja, like rootkoots revealed kind of thing, for it to matter as a bug, just bricking some of this equipment means there's no water for a long, long time.
Yeah, you can literally kill populace with a DDoS.
But they're stealthy. They're using stealthy techniques now.
Yeah,
because they just want to. It seems
China
to me like,
is absolutely.
China just wants to hang out in our systems, is what I'm observing. Right, a lot of it's just they're just in there hanging out. And the techniques and tactics that I see them deploying today definitely speak to as evidence that they're just there to hang out.
You
But
send
let's
scouts before you send the
Right.
military party. I mean,
but let's say you find them. It's hard to find them, first of all, especially when you don't have a single security person on staff. But let's say they're found. Let's say they're evicted. Unless you're going to change your posture, you're going to get
Right.
owned again tomorrow.
Mhm.
Like the recidivism rate is fluid. It's effortless. Like when we talk to a target rich cyber poor living below Wendy Nathan's security poverty line owner and
Mhm.
operator, 85% of the owners and operators of hospitals, of water and wastewater, of small, medium, rural electrical co-ops, they're price fixed, they're razor thin, they don't have a single security person, they can't do best practices, they don't know who to call. If they want to invest, they might not be able to. I talked to one water guy like a month ago that said we asked the town to give us was the ability to have unique logins and accounts per person, and they said no because the outsourced IT is the mayor's buddy. Like,
Mhm.
so there's really no way that you're going to keep out, even if you can find and evict with government help, they're going to get right back in because we're over dependent on undependable things. There's a cost to connectivity,
Mhm.
and we haven't paid it yet. So we've enjoyed this like peacetime where it's mostly been low consequence, financially driven, aimed at enterprises, aimed at wallets.
Yep. Yep.
But those same exposures can be used by anybody for anything.
you know, we've
Mhm.
become dependent upon, back to the usability versus security. We believe usability is the default. We believe it is almost a right at this point, not a privilege. And we don't question the fact that availability is it's tenuous. We just live in this world of availability, high availability, everything. I turn the faucet, my water comes on. I click on Amazon, the package shows up on my porch. Like it's all about availability, and we have never looked at as a society under those covers.
Yeah, we throw these words around a lot like they're synonymous, like privacy, security, resilience. They're not. Like when
Mm-mm.
you're solving for resilience, you're solving for a different thing than when you're solving for privacy.
Mhm.
And I don't want to get into hospital discussions. I was in the hospital a lot lately. But I think for something, and you just went right back to, Paul, I've known you a long time. We're friendly. You just went right back to enterprise thinking. So
Mhm.
think of all the talent pool that's going to go to RSA conference, and they're all there paid by their employers to defend their employers. But every single employee that works for their employer or the manufacturing facility that has to make that widget, they're all dependent on water and power. And when the water and
Mm-hmm.
power goes away, we put all our talent on individual
Mhm.
businesses instead of the population of the country, right?
Right. Because it's economics, right?
Right.
The
Which is
it,
great until it doesn't work, right?
well,
Right.
and critical infrastructure is an interesting from an economic standpoint. And someone I want to say like in Guardians, we're talking about security of the grid, and it came up in conversation that the electrical grid, electric companies are like one of the few companies in industries that want you to use less of
Yeah.
their product. Right? You work for a commercial company, you want people to buy more and use more of your product, right? But it gets flipped when you go to critical infrastructure. They want you to use less. Right? It's
Well,
backwards.
we befriended a bunch of water people, and we have recordings of this if you want to see it. Besides Las Vegas, this guy Dean Ford, last couple
Mhm.
of years has attended, and last two he presented. But he's a professional engineer in the water industry, and he part of his talk was saying, how much do you pay for your water bill? Do you know that usually every gallon of water you're getting is at a loss to the provider? Like you're paying less
Right.
than they are, and so we have this expectation that this stuff is going to be a certain price. It's going to be reliable. It's going to be available.
Availability.
Right. And the
Mhm.
more
It's
things
just
we do
magic.
and the more adversaries that show up. Remember, Rome, the great, empire of Rome was not like directly invaded in the streets, hand to hand combat, like Game of Thrones, finales. They sacked the aqueducts. They sacked the water supplies into Rome, right? Like we don't need to go after the Fortune 5, Fortune 50 companies. You can take out basic human infrastructure and we're 48 hours from Lord of the Flies. Like you can do some real harm if it came to that. Now, I don't want to be just speaking doom and gloom. One of the things Alan said a minute ago that made me grit my teeth is let's say someone is trying to protect their enterprise or they're trying to invest in some security. Someone just recently posted a breakdown of the CISA-KEV list, the known exploited vulnerabilities, like the top
Yeah.
exploited ones.
Yeah.
And there were a bunch of asterisks next to a few, and they didn't say what the asterisk was. And I kind of like squinted. I'm like, what's the pattern here? These were security products. The ones with the asterisk were the security products. Such a large amount of these remote appliance pizza boxes that are on unsupported end of life hardware or unsupported end of life, OS, and they're not patched and they're not patchable. And they, part of the reason people pushed so hard against SBOM is they knew they were using broken, exploitable stuff and didn't want to have to update it because they got bought by a PE firm. Rob Kanacki, former White House guy, is going to come visit me today. And he's a New Englander as well. And he was shown some research that once a PE firm buys a security product, the number of flaws that go up, security flaws in the product go way up, like right away.
Surprise, surprise.
So it doesn't mean that this is all evil. It's just that, like, even when someone has an instinct to maybe secure their enterprise or their operational environment, the security products they buy are sometimes worse than the normal IT stuff. So
I think we've always said that where we can increase our attack surface by implementing more technology to help secure our environments.
Yeah, Mudge had that talk, but even before that,
Mudge? Mudge did have a talk on that.
He had remember the B-sides at that little sketchy hotel on the outskirts of town before, what was it called? But the Artisan, he had a keynote at the Artisan one year showing some of those stats. But even before that, Veracode was showing like some of the worst security findings were security products. But that's not just to like to poke us in the eye. It's just back to that meta point that if you're over dependent on an undependable thing, right? So digital infrastructure is everywhere. We're putting it in more places. That rate of adoption is outpacing our rate to make it trustworthy. Like, this is not a sustainable trend. So then it becomes, where is that trust? Where is it acceptable to YOLO, just take a risk and F around and find out? And where is it not acceptable? And I think we got to start retreating on areas where we're overexposed with dire consequences. And I don't mean retreat forever. I mean retreat for now.
Because I think organizations are acquiring security appliances, let's say, keep it to that, to advance their security programs with less work and responsibility than if they were to build it themselves, right? It's similar. I think, Josh, you pointed this out to the cloud shared responsibility model. Which I have a note to go back to some of your and I think Hoff's previous research, right?
And Mogul and
and that relates to cloud. But we're in the same, I think, a very similar situation with security appliances, in that we're acquiring these because we're like, we want the responsibility of all that stuff to be someone else. We want to get this appliance in there, and we just want to worry about the functionality it's providing, not what's underneath it. Similar to how you would deploy a cloud application, you're trusting Amazon, Google, Microsoft to do the underlying plumbing. It's all secure. It's great. The problem that we have now is, for a lot of reasons, the security appliances have so many weaknesses and design flaws.
Not to pick on CrowdStrike, but that's the perfect example. It used to be that I had to patch all my stuff, and hey, the vendor will do the patching now. We're cool, right?
Well, that was content. It was not.
Still, at the end of the day, it was an abdication of responsibility to the vendor, a task traditionally performed by the in-house team, now handed off to a vendor who provides a security product.
I don't have it handy, but that Serenity prayer.
Oh yeah,
I grew up hearing. David Etchu and I made a talk at RSA one year, and we had it. It was like, give me I'll find it and send it to you. But it was like, give me the relevant controls where I can have them, and blah blah blah, and the trust and accountability are attestations. But we just modified the prayer. But I think where we are is, and we haven't gotten, and we probably won't get into in the remaining time, that there's some headwinds in expecting the federal government to fix these things right now. Like, there's just a rhythm to how public policy works. I've been very heavily involved in public policy for a long time, and we're kind of entering an unfavorable period if you want to see more consistent trust and accountability in digital infrastructure that we depend upon, for a bunch of reasons, and they're not even partisan. Like, it's just, look at what happened with SolarWinds. There was this huge surge
Mm-hmm.
to the executive order 14028 to say the trust we place should be proportional, trustworthy, and transparent. So it was basically saying the digital infrastructure the federal government buys has to be more trustworthy and transparent. That included SBOM and included attestations for SDLC. You saw the rise of secure by design, secure by default push from CISA.
Yeah.
The White House is a cyber seal check mark thing they were pushing, FTC, FCC. So like there was a general surge towards this, but in parallel, irrespective of who won the elections, the Chevron doctrine, I'll do that in 60 seconds or less. For a long, long time, there was a doctrine called Chevron deference, which was if it's unclear if the regulator has the authority to do something or not in the regulated space, tie goes to the regulator. Basically, tie goes to the runner in baseball, tie goes to the regulator. And there was a Bright versus Loper case that went all the way to the Supreme Court that basically replaced this doctrine, which now says, well, unless the regulator has explicit overt authorities in the law, you can sue them. So it doesn't mean that tie goes to the, to the others. But what that meant is that line I'm making in my hands is ambiguity, right? For a long time, it's so hard to pass laws through Congress. The lawmakers decided, especially on technology, we want valuable, deliberate ambiguity because it'll future-proof the law. We don't have to keep making new laws when tech changes. We just say, this is the intent of the law. The regulator can interpret that over time with guidance because they're the experts.
Mm-hmm.
Bright Loper overturned that now, and anytime you see ambiguity, it's like a wealthy enough advisor or somebody can sue and win.
Take the regulator to court, basically,
Right.
and challenge the whatever penalties, fines, or regulations are put in place.
Spiffy.
So what that means is a lot of the laws we wrote intelligently and with valuable ambiguity are now a liability for now, and that new laws will have to be more specific, but that means they'll be more brittle.
Mm-hmm.
So we're in this recalibration period. You could still, when you go to court, they'll still defer to the wisdom of the regulator in most cases, but you're allowed to sue them, which takes time and money.
Yep.
So that was 60 seconds ish. But let's just say if you retreat, if you look at the executive order with all that groundswell, the word SBOM shows up like 18 times, but CISA wasn't even allowed to mention the word SBOM in the self-attestation form. So what was supposed to be an artifact that's machine generated, machine readable, standardized, now isn't. It's like a trust me pinky swear. I promise I have one, but I won't show it to you. And it doesn't even say SBOM. So we really gutted that because the private sector lobbyists and trade associations successfully said, we don't want to eat any vegetables. Like, no, thank you.
Yeah.
So there's not really, we tried to add more trust and transparency through artifacts and failed. And I was talking to Paul last week and he's like, hey, there's all these features that are highly available, very usable to handle some of these hardware and firmware trust issues, but people aren't using them, right? They're there, but they're not being used. And I'm like, well, this sounds like a great opportunity to at least have some labeling or some signaling in the market that allows free market forces to say, I want a higher assurance appliance. You need to attest to which of these commonly available measures you're using.
Yeah.
And I love
that, Josh, because where we're at today is security appliances are delivered and the vendors just like, just trust us. You get as much transparency as we want to give you, which today across the board is not a lot. And what's under the covers in these devices is what attackers are preying upon. Yeah. And there's certain defensive technologies and design decisions that could have been made before this product came to market that can thwart many of these attacks that we're seeing in the wild.
Available mitigations.
To
give you an example, I don't want to pick on Sophos because Sophos did a fantastic job to speak to transparency. They were fully transparent in this 4 or 5 year long investigation. However, what we're discovering is there are certain things that protect the UEFI and BIOS on these systems, like Intel Boot Guard, that aren't being put in place. And so what we want is regulations that can be smart about requiring that these security controls are put in place and the vendor is attesting that they are put in place. But Josh, what I think you're saying is they can now contest that in court, basically, and make it a messy process if they don't want to.
For 30 seconds, pretend we definitely have a hot conflict coming with China in 2027. Yeah. So we have 2 years. So pretend for a thought experiment. We have 2 years to design this regulation, vote on this regulation, have notice of proposed rulemaking on this regulation, agree to this regulation, have people willing to enforce this regulation,
It's
Are we
way more
going to
than 2
buy and
years.
replace? Are we going to build and buy and
right.
replace? No. So it's too
And
late.
have the private
It's
sector
too late.
take it on the chin and just agree to it on the first pass because we're
And they're
out of
gonna-
time. Yeah.
They're going to hand wring and blah, blah, blah. So,
Oh, yeah, of course.
So you have to look at this in phases. Like, it's too late for certain things. It's not too late for the next crisis after that, or horizon after that, or the next after that. So we should always be striving to do the right thing. But I would say the reason this project I'm doing is so focused on 2027 is it almost says everything the federal government's been doing, fine, great, but it won't manifest fruit in the time horizons we need. So what can we do locally? What can you do in your household, your town, your county, your state that can make you more resilient in the face of these disruptions? So I would say that if you could design the perfect thing, Paul, we'd make you in charge of like digital infrastructure, trust and transparency worldwide, right? You'd probably eventually want some stable, harmonized, reasonable regulation. Short of that, you'd say, okay, we can't make people do these things, but we can make you be transparent about the things you are doing so that someone who wants to buy better can identify better.
Right.
Yeah.
So you would push for a transparency regime. Short of that, I think where we are now is we should be stoking free market demand that says you deserve better digital infrastructure than you're getting. Here's what better looks like. Every time you vote with your wallet, here's the things you should be through contract and purchasing asking for. Onesie, twosie, it's not so great. That's why you tend to go for either transparency regime or regulation regime, because you want everybody to benefit from a common thing.
Mm-hmm.
But when Goldman Sachs asked for something, they tended to get it, right? When Mayo Clinic asked for something, they tended to get. They were the 800-pound gorillas of their industries. But if you have an industry say, we're not going to buy security embedded opaque black boxes anymore, you're going to have to attest that you have these countermeasures in place, or we're going to buy a competitor that does. Or
that's a consumer driven and a demand driven model. And the challenge is, I'll throw this one out as a counterpoint. There was a study done on the banks.
Yep.
Like, how many consumers wanted their bank to implement MFA? And the answer was, oh no, that's a big inconvenience. I don't want that. Right. So there's a groundswell of demand that has to occur for that model to work. Just like there's a somehow excessive authoritative push to get it to go from the other direction. Like there is no win here. We can't rally the troops to say, give us, but we can't rally the citizens and the companies and the entities to say, give us better now, any more than we can rally the government to say, push this through and make it happen in 2 years.
Yeah, but this is maybe going to sound defeatist, but the options for regulation are unlikely or off the table or too slow right now. The options for transparency that have been pushing for 10 years have recently suffered some losses. The only thing I've seen work in the wherever it could is when you had a sector kind of say, we need the following things from anyone selling to us. So it's more like collective bargaining at the sector level than it was individual buyers. When you go direct to consumer, MFA is too hard.
Yeah, you're cheesed.
Yeah.
But who are these sectors that can lead this? Who are the sectors that can lead the charge that have the wherewithal to band together and make demands?
Well,
banking?
The two that I think of right now are DOD, because if we're on the cusp of 3 wars or so, they're good at advocating for what they want. They have some constraints on how they can ask for what they want, but they know how important SBOM is, HBOM is, XBOM is, firmware stuff. They have burned their hands on stoves, so they are an increasingly vocal advocate for how hot these stoves are. Energy sector is starting to get some mojo. Medical devices already have the law behind them. So that was an example where we did get a regulation across with the Patch Act. So I think I'm just going to start going direct to owners and operators of critical infrastructure, because I care less if credit cards are stolen or there's a financial crime than I do if people get hurt. But typically, let me just microcosm this one more time on the medical devices. The best part about the Patch Act requiring SBOMs and threat models and other things in law is now that it's been implemented for a while, everyone that says it can't be done has been proven to be full of poo-poo.
Right.
So they became the existence proof that these are being done. They're being done at scale. The smaller innovators have no problem doing them because they have modern build tools and build chains. And all the excuses and hand wringings have been removed. So sometimes you want to go everywhere first. And other times you want to say, no, let's prove how valuable it is to have trustworthy, transparent hardware, firmware, software stack. In one sector. And then when we know it's worked, then maybe we adopt it elsewhere. That's not going to help me for 2027, but we could find the most motivated subsectors that have been burned by this and invest in them, and then maybe we can help other people later.
But we have to help them know what to ask for. And
Yes.
so I built a slide on this. I want to get your feedback, and I describe it. So on two icons, one represents Windows, one represents any type of security or network appliance, right? When you get Windows from Microsoft, there are things that you do to make it more secure, and there are things you add to it to make it more secure.
Right.
You do some kind of configuration hardening that maybe is driven by compliance for your sector. You add an EDR to that. You add maybe vulnerability management, maybe in the form of an agent to manage all the vulnerabilities on it. You maybe add BitLocker. Maybe compliance is driving. In fact, Alan, I think we've been through this, right? Compliance drives, you will have BitLocker
Right.
and hard drive encryption enabled. Doesn't matter if it's in a data center in a secure facility or not, you will have this technology. When we get a network or security appliance, the only thing we have is, we just trust what the vendor is doing. The vendor's not held accountable or responsible for any of those things that we just spoke about in the context of Windows. So what we want is not just better visibility, but better capabilities to treat these systems the way that we treat many of our other systems in our organization.
Yeah, it's almost become habit with Windows, right? Like even Joe average user isn't questioning anymore that we do security stuff on Windows. I think that's been integrated into society as a whole. Like even my mom gets that, right?
Right. Where's my EDR from my IoT router?
Yeah, where's the thingy that makes Windows safer? Because I know I need the thingy, right?
I wish I could sew a slide, or Audie and I use Miro to make like a flow chart about one of our SBOM groups. So pretend I don't say SBOM, but like it's basically a decision tree that says, can I have an SBOM? If the answer is yes, you're like, okay, so this is like for procurement and acquisition people. Like, can I have an SBOM? If the answer was yes, you're like, okay, you're basically done. And then it was, okay, if not, then it was like, will you strike the anti-reverse engineering clauses from our terms and conditions so that we can assess the risk of our products? Okay. Number 2 is, will you attest that there are no known exploited vulnerabilities in the product, and promise in contract language that you will tell us within 30 days if one is revealed? The next one is like, will you attest that there are no end of life software components in your supply chain? Will you attest this? Will you test that? Will you test this? And what you essentially saw was the easy button was just give them the freaking SBOM already. And the hard button was, if you won't give me the visibility or control, then you're going to take on legal accountability for that opacity. So you're going to pay one way or the other. We need trust. So either give us the ability to defend ourselves, or take on more onus with cashback penalties if you are found to be, be derelict, or I think you know this, but FTC's best weapon is fraudulent claims. So if someone says they did something and they weren't, then they're in trouble with the FTC. So I want to make it not where like I want this and it's a binary yes or no. It's in lieu of this. Sunil, you must know him, right?
Yeah, of course.
Sunil says he used to do this at Bank of America. He'd say, give me the SBOM. If not, I want a 20% discount on maintenance until you give me one.
Nice.
And that was just one of the things he asked for. And this is what I mean by empowerment of maybe large enterprise buyers, because they're tired of getting burned by an Avanti device or a Citrix thing or this or that, or and they expect more, so they should be able to put in language with hooks and purchasing requirements. It might raise the cost of goods a little bit, but they'll have less surprise or more accountability. So in the Windows example you say in your slide, there's a bunch of stuff you can do directly to that environment to affect your outcome. And where you lack the ability to do that, you have to contract it in or hold someone else accountable.
Right.
And if they won't do it, don't give them your business.
Yeah.
Right.
And that's the accountability, because right now, many appliance, network and security appliance vendors don't want you and do things specifically so you can't see what's under the hood, right? They're encrypting their firmware. They are restricting access to the underlying, firmware, hardware, software, and putting guardrails on there. Try and ask an LLM how you jailbreak XYZ big security appliance, right? The LLM's going to come back like, I can't help you. I can't help you do that. Right? That's not what you're supposed to be doing, Paul. Now you're on some list somewhere. Great. It probably already was on the list, but
and I've been negative Nelly this whole show, which is weird for me. I'm normally the one with the optimistic outlook, but I want to point out something you said, Josh, which is the large enterprises. Yeah, okay, so they've got that 900-pound gorilla clout to boss those vendors around, but the little guys, give me an SBOM or give me these costs and penalties and this harder path. Vendor's just going to walk away from the deal.
Yeah, what I've noticed though is once someone puts in a practice to be able to make and share SBOMs for their bigger complaining customers,
then it works for everyone.
else.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure. And there's companies that publish their SBOMs, right? Like that, it's catching on.
And I didn't mean to make this SBOM, and I know we're almost at time.
No,
here.
no, no. I like
Yeah.
SBOMs. I think it's all about how you use them, right? And I think it's a very important aspect and component to our discussion today. But
Paul, I can't wait to see the slides. I can't wait to see your public talks about this. But like, if you zoom out, whether it's SBOM, HBOM, your thing, I think the meta here is we are over dependent on undependable digital infrastructure. How do we make more trust and transparency in digital infrastructure? And then for operators, how do you only trust something to the degree to which it's trustworthy? Like the use cases that are too dangerous, don't do it. The use cases that you can YOLO, go for it. But like, we have not reckoned with proportionality of trust and trustworthiness. And
at all.
The things you're doing and probing at are just showing you there's more categories where we need more trust and transparency, but it's going to be a while before we right size.
And we need better defenses. One of my other concerns that I highlighted in a talk recently was if we look at the manufacturers, I won't name names, right? I maintain a list: enterprise security and network appliance vendors, small enterprise, SOHO, small business ones, and then IoT, right? And that I use that obviously here at Eclipsium to kind of focus our engineering and research efforts. But when I look at even just the small enterprise, small business targeted devices, the larger enterprise security vendors do not support them to the same level that they do enterprise appliances.
Of course not.
And so some evidence I have in that is the attacks against Sophos, right? If you do a little bit of research, like what I did recently, you got to name vendors, but it's not as well supported. Sophos, as an example, not as well supported by larger enterprise security vendors because it's not their target market, right?
Yeah.
The larger enterprise security vendors are going after the Fortune 1000 and enterprise companies. We're not necessarily using the small, medium business targeted products. They're using the enterprise products. Therefore, we have much better security. But the attackers, I think, know this. And they're like, oh, well, I'll just go target these devices because I know that company probably doesn't have big enterprise security label that's doing vulnerability management, that's doing NDR at the level where they can detect us.
Well, Allan, Paul's heard me say this before, but I think it was the first RSA where it was after people returned after the pandemic.
Yeah.
I started losing my mind during it, just ranting a lot. Again, losing my mind. But I was drawing a pyramid, and I'm like, the Fortune 100, 500, 1,000 is at the top of the pyramid, and then there's everybody else, right?
Yeah.
And they're the ones that show up at RSA. They're the ones who buy RSA products at RSA. And forever, attackers and defenders focused on the top of the pyramid because why do you rob banks? That's where the money is. But then I said ransomware, it was a financial innovation in that it found a way to monetize this everyone else, monetize down the pyramid, monetize the cyber poor. And in contrast, while the attackers had figured out how to monetize the cyber poor, the defenders have not, and the financially driven vendor has not. So we have this unmitigated feeding frenzy on the bottom. I think the same is true for Paul's point about Soho, is that there's just not a lot of money or spend there. So why would you make more investment or defense there? So we have this asymmetry where the attackers innovated down market and the defenders can't figure out how to innovate down market.
Yep.
Right.
Yeah. I spent 12 years defending embedded systems. I worked for a company who sold products up and down that pyramid.
Yeah.
And we had internal security was very tight. We did what we were supposed to do inside the product, but there were still terms and conditions and rules and things that the consumer had to do. And we would jump on Shodan and we would see a bajillion systems that weren't where they were supposed to be. And inevitably, if we did the research, it wasn't the large enterprises, it was the little guys. It's not just what they can afford. It's not just how much the vendors support them. It's the fact that they're not staffed up and empowered to do the basics on their own anyway. I mean, something as simple as put this thing behind a firewall, guys, really, I don't know what that means. I don't have a firewall. I don't, it was amazing to see the cyber poverty manifested in real time on Shodan.
but like when you see that cyber poverty line, this is a conversation on and off with me and Wendy over the years.
Yeah.
When we see that poverty line, do we admire it? Is that the end of the story? Or is it, hey, there's most of them are below the poverty line and we have to do something to help them? I'm in the end, we have to do something to help them.
We proactively reached out. I'd reach out to customers and say, stuff I sold you that I said put behind a firewall is on the internet. Just FYI, that's a bad thing. What do you need help with? We would do it. My team would actively reach out to customers.
So I would say I'm not expecting a for-profit capitalistic, country to stop doing that.
Right.
What I am saying is some portion of our attention should invert that math and say we should help the target-rich cyber poor for our lifeline critical infrastructure.
Yeah, agreed.
In addition to all that making the money.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
I'm not saying we should flip it for a small, medium, like a bodega, right? I don't want to make a fractional CISO for a bodega before we make a fractional CISO for water and wastewater.
Right. Absolutely.
And this undisruptable 27.org thing is we have to make sure that we at least warn people that hurricanes are going to make landfall. They're coming your way.
Yeah.
Inform, influence, inspire on water and healthcare. And
yeah.
And I want people like yourselves to be, at the ready to assist if we are starting to see a left a boom and right a boom, but assist and be helpful helpers to your community. And one of the ways to do the show is make sure your household has water and food so that you can be available to help.
Right.
But in the unlikely event of a water landing, I want people to know what to do. And when I say unlikely event of water disruption, it's much more likely than the unlikely event of a water landing. So unless timetables change with China, we are currently on a course where we cannot let them advance on Taiwan in the time frame where they warned us don't intervene. So we have an unpleasant scenario unfolding. Unless timetables change, we may see some level of disruption on U.S. soil. So I don't like that. I kind of like to eat. I kind of like water.
Yeah.
I kind of like heat in the winter, cool in the summer. But we've got 2 years that we could do something if some of us raise our head up and say, yes, let's do our day job. Yes, let's continue to be capitalistic. And we've got to get really creative on target-rich cyber poor lifeline critical infrastructure.
But I think it was a great summary of giving some people ideas and at least driving them in the right direction, what we do for the next 2 years to address all the issues that we talked about today. Josh, I want to thank you very much for appearing on Below the Surface. Allan, as always, thank you very much. Thanks, everyone, for listening and watching. We'll see you next time.